должностных лиц знаем поименно. Продолжая театральную терминологию, определили жанр как политический фарс с элементами детектива. Для некоторых этот фарс стал трагическим. Да, он мог обернуться трагефарсом для многих, для всех. Бог миловал. Мне не интересно говорить об известных и высокопоставленных участниках этих событий и с нашей, и с их стороны. Это дело для политических комментаторов и журналистов, интересующихся политикой. На мой взгляд, дилетанта куда как интереснее героическая массовка, москвичи и гости столицы, россияне, сограждане, защитники. Понедельник. Утренняя политинформация, подкрепленная военным парадом. Как жить дальше? Отняли свободу, уже ставшую привычной, почти бытовой. Свободу возмущаться и говорить прилюдно. Свободу рассказывать политические анекдоты. Какой давно забытый термин. Политические анекдоты в незнакомом кругу. Не будет больше левой прессы, не будет бульварной, никакой не будет. Телевизор смотрит голубым глазом дебила. Радио «Свобода» пока констатирует факты. Эхо Москвы связали и в рот ему сунули кляп. Как жить? Выход один. На улицу. Сразу танком не задавит. Поговорим, посоветуемся. Разберемся.
На всякий случай я хочу вам рассказать наиболее эффективную целесообразную тактику борьбы с танками и с ПТРами. Есть возможность, что они могут двинуться на нас. В этом случае что надо делать? Танки надо встречать не за баррикадами, а вне баррикад. То есть надо идти на танки. Если поступит такая информация, то первым делом надо идти сразу на танки. Но при этом никаких оскорблений, там типа фашисты, идиоты, ничего не надо. Желательно объяснять людям, что мы такие же россияне.
Так пришли к Белому дому многие мои знакомые. Потому что каждый человек должен иметь свой дом, а каждый народ должен иметь свой белый дом. А свой дом нужно защищать. Страшно было? Да, конечно, страшно. Стоишь вот так и ждешь танков или еще чего похуже.
Разобрать завалы для обхода. Справа и слева. Так, 4-й взвод. Да. Один.
Так, все лишние покиньте.
Ко мне.
В последнем автобусе есть медпункт. Всех раненых сносят туда. А у нас свои есть.
As we said, this is a documentary shot by the Ekron cable TV channel back in August of 1991 and shown to their viewers. We'll show more of this as the rest of this hour goes on, but in our studios now is Steve Effros, who is president of the Community Antenna Television Association. When did you go last to Russia?
I was there at the end of October and the beginning of November, Brian. I was invited to a conference where the independent media people were getting together to try to start their own association and to look at the various media laws that are being written by everybody. I mean, one of the big questions is who writes the laws these days. And asked for the advice and counsel of others who had gone through these experiences in terms of what those media laws should look like, what their First Amendment might appear to be in the future.
Where were you?
We were in Novgorod, which is a small town, former capital at one point, which is about 2 hours south of St. Petersburg.
And
so between St. Petersburg, we were in Russia, but there were representatives of independent media and regulators, at least, from virtually every one of the republics.
All right, when you see us talking about this cable channel in Vitaly Shamov's apartment complex, and you see this documentary, what, I don't know if you were here long enough to see that one of the interviewers is a deputy on the Moscow City Council. The mayor of the city, Mayor Popov, was there in their studios. Also someone who was, at one point, I guess, according to our group, going to oppose Boris Yeltsin. Do you think the people that view this are getting a free approach to the media?
Well, I think they're getting. I think they're getting a new, a freer approach to the media. One of the issues that we spent a lot of time in this conference on was trying to define what is independent media in the Soviet Union, and it relates directly to one of the questions that the caller from New York had a few minutes ago. The conclusion after 2 days of debate was that an independent media at that time, the Soviet Union, was anything that got less than 49% of its monies from the state. Now, you know, in the United States that would be an unheard of definition, but in the Soviet Union, at least 3-4 months ago, there was no other source of income. There was no other perceived source of income. And therefore, in order to start a cable system, as the gentleman from New York asked, where did the money come from for the amplifiers? Where did the money come from for the wires? Those were owned by the state. Everything was owned by the state. When you talk about independent media, there, you get somewhat schizophrenic, because on the one hand, there are people who are talking about truly independent media, like we have here. They want their own transmitters, their own studios, and so on. That presents a real difficulty right now, because if you're going to do over-the-air broadcasting, you need a license, or you need something to use the spectrum so that people don't interfere on the over-the-air spectrum. But the processes for granting spectrum licenses in the republics in the Soviet Union have fallen apart. And indeed, what you find is even the technicians who have some familiarity with spectrum were not aware of how much spectrum there was available, because most of it was assigned to the military. When you get into the franchises and who has the right to dig up the streets and how do you get the copper wires, these are massive problems, and there are no clear answers to them right now. So sometimes when you talk about independent media there, they're talking about a slightly different thing. Mr. Yakovlev was here. I don't know whether C-SPAN carried the Yakovlev speech from Anaheim.
No, but we just showed him meeting with Boris Yeltsin. Well, where Mr. Yeltsin said the Soviet Ostankino facility is now mine, or he said at least it was
that's the problem.
Belonged to Russia. And what we're trying to sort out here with Vitaly Shamov is whether or not it's really free to say whatever it wants to say.
Well, I was talking with Yakovlev and Mr. Zolotarevsky, who is his assistant or his chief of international affairs, when they were out in California a couple of weeks ago, and talked to them about the meeting we had with the independents in Novgorod. And they were dismissive of independent media. They didn't see any need for it, or that any of these people had any likelihood of success. They talked about the global satellite link-up that you're now talking about, I heard you mention a little while ago. And Mr. Yakovlev was saying, well, we have independent media now. What we do is we have independent teams of producers and journalists, and they compete with each other, as they did in Moscow, or actually on the entire state television system recently, between the old Vremya team and a new team putting news together, and then they asked, which one do you prefer? And that they consider independent media, because now you have at least some effort to cater to what the viewer wants to see and hear. I was mentioning just before we got on the air, there was a professor at this conference. We were talking about independent media. I have my notes from the conference because I thought that he said it very well. He was arguing, this is Professor Sharel, he's a Soviet professor of journalism. And he argued that independence in the West for journalists equates to economic and speech freedom from the state. Here, he said, it may simply be independence to see and talk about various points of view. He's defining independence differently. He said this is a major difference from the black and white perception of the past. And then he went on and he argued that there are no true journalists in the Soviet Union because the profession of journalism in the Soviet Union until just a few months ago had to do with making sure your boss was happy with what you said and did and how you presented the news, not what the people who were watching you thought. And therefore, he noted that virtually all questions are asked, this is the way he said it, questions are asked which are supposed to be asked, not which should be asked. And it was a political sensitivity of the journalist to make sure he asked the right question of whoever he was interviewing. And they have the journalists have no experience of doing anything else.
If you've just joined us, we're talking about Russia and Moscow and this day, January the 2nd, where prices are decontrolled somewhat in Moscow, and our guest is Vitaly Shamov, who is from Moscow and has only been in this country since Saturday afternoon. First trip, except for what? A trip to Nicaragua last year.
A year ago.
First time out of the Soviet Union or Moscow, and first time in the United States. And Steve Effros, president of the Community Antenna Television Association. I got to ask, before I ask Vitaly direct what you said, what are you doing as the president of the Community Antenna Television Association over in Russia, teaching them about regulation? How'd you get into it?
It's two parts. Part one is that I have a wife who has a tremendous influence over me, and she has been involved in conflict resolution, and particularly with children, using intercultural experiences in the arts, and a play called Peace Child is what she got involved with back in 1986. And that was a play that was used to put Soviet and American kids together. And so since 1986, we have been working with Soviet folks and Americans, particularly in the arts, putting them together in intercultural exchange programs, getting American and Soviet kids together, both here and in the Soviet Union. Back then, it was we were not looked upon too highly as being patriotic. Now everybody's doing it. But what that led to was a lot of contacts in the Soviet Union and a lot of very grassroots understanding of the people. So when all of these things started to happen, I also, as you note, am a part of the Community Antenna Television Association. I've been involved in media regulation in the United States for the last 20 years or so. And
how long were you at the Federal Communications Commission?
I was there for 5 years. I wrote the federal rules on cable television.
You're a lawyer?
I'm a lawyer. I do all those terrible
Originally
things.
from
lobbying.
New York City, are you?
Yeah, New York.
And worked, I remember, didn't you work for the New York Times and ABC for a while?
I was at ABC and NBC Network News down here and New York Times in New York.
Now, Vitaly Shamov, you listened to what Mr. Effros had to say about journalists in your country. Did you agree with him, or?
Partly. At some points I agree, and at some points I disagree.
What do you disagree about?
Now I disagree. The points on disagreement is the following: that they feel themselves, in spite of what's going on in the Soviet Union, they feel themselves independent, and maybe we understand something different when we call independence. But in our country, it was like a wound that we couldn't properly be independent from whatever he was, whatever he could be. And now, when everything is permissible, but of course on reasonable limits, and people are trying to consider themselves independent, and